The bank manager's voice was calm, almost apologetic, as if he were telling me the weather had changed. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "your savings account balance is currently $312. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I pressed the phone closer to my ear and stared at the familiar numbers written in my checkbook, the ones I'd updated just 2 weeks earlier. "That's not possible," I said quietly. "There should be much more than that." There was a pause on the line, papers rustled. "I'm looking at multiple withdrawals," he replied, "large ones over time." My stomach tightened. I felt the edge of the kitchen counter against my hip, cold and solid, as if I needed proof that something in my life was still stable. "Withdrawals by who?" I asked. Another pause, longer this time. "By an authorized user on the account," he said, "your son." I hung up the phone and stood there, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick on the wall. The house smelled faintly of coffee and toast, burnt just a little the way I'd always liked it. Ordinary smells, ordinary sounds. Nothing about that moment felt ordinary. Because the savings he was talking about wasn't just money. It was my future. Before everything unraveled, I was proud of the life I'd built. I raised my son Marcus on a teacher's salary and stubborn determination. His father and I divorced when Marcus was 9, and from that moment on, I learned how to stretch a dollar until it almost snapped. I clipped coupons, I worked summers, I said no to myself more times than I could count so I could say yes to him. When Marcus got into college, I cried harder than I did at my own graduation. "I'll pay for it," I told him. "You focus on learning, that's my job." And I meant it. I opened the savings account years earlier with one purpose, to make sure my son never had to choose between tuition and groceries, between dreams and debt. I added to it faithfully, month after month, even when it meant skipping vacations or driving the same car far longer than I should have. Marcus was grateful, or at least I thought he was. When he married Elise, I believed I was gaining a daughter. She was soft-spoken, always smiling, the kind of woman who knew how to make compliments sound sincere. She thanked me often, too often, now that I look back. "You've done so much for Marcus," she'd say, squeezing my hand. "We're so lucky to have you." Lucky. I didn't realize then how carefully she said we. After the wedding, things shifted in small ways. Marcus stopped calling as often. When he did, his voice sounded distracted, like he was always halfway somewhere else. Elise, on the other hand, checked in regularly. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Are you resting enough? Money must be tight with everything costing so much these days." At first, I thought she was being thoughtful. Then she started mentioning bills, student loans, rent, emergencies that came up unexpectedly. "Marcus hates asking you for help," she told me once, shaking her head. "He doesn't want to burden you." I smiled. "He's my son, he's never a burden." She nodded, eyes warm. "That's what makes you such a good mother." The first time Marcus asked to borrow money, he sounded embarrassed. "Just temporary," he said. "I'll pay it back." "Don't worry about it," I replied. "That's what the savings are for." I didn't see his hesitation, or maybe I chose not to. I added his name to the account so he wouldn't have to ask every time. It felt practical, trusting, loving. "I'll be careful," he promised. And I believed him. The withdrawals didn't happen all at once. They happened quietly. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, always explained away with reasons that sounded responsible enough. Medical bills, car trouble, an opportunity that couldn't wait. Each time, Elise followed up with gratitude. "You've saved us," she'd say. "We don't know what we'd do without you." I felt needed, useful, like I was still doing my job as a mother. What I didn't notice, what I refused to notice, was how the requests became more frequent and Marcus less involved in the conversations. More often than not, it was Elise who called. "Marcus is so stressed," she'd say softly. "I don't want him worrying about money when he's working so hard." I didn't realize she was slowly replacing his voice with her own. The real warning came the day I mentioned downsizing. "I've been thinking," I told Marcus over the phone, "maybe I'll sell the house next year, move somewhere smaller." There was silence on the line, then Elise's voice cut in. She must have been on speaker. "Oh, you don't need to rush into that," she said quickly. "You're still young." I frowned. I'm thinking about retirement. Well, she replied a little too brightly, Marcus and I were hoping you'd stay nearby, in case we need help. Need help? Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten, but Marcus laughed it off. Mom, you're not going anywhere, he said. You'll always be fine. I wanted to believe that. The day I discovered the truth wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation. Just numbers on a screen that didn't add up. I drove to the bank in a fog, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly. The manager showed me statements, pages and pages of withdrawals, dates stretching back years. This can't be right, I whispered. He would. The manager didn't interrupt, he just waited. By the time I got home, my legs felt weak. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the drawer where I kept old receipts, birthday cards, and the acceptance letter from Marcus's college. I ran my thumb over his name, printed in bold ink. I had paid for his education so he could build a better life. And now, somehow, that life had been built on my emptying hands. When Marcus came over that evening, I already knew what I was going to ask. What happened to my savings? I said. He froze in the doorway. Elise stepped in beside him, her hand slipping easily into his arm. Mom, Marcus began, it's not what you think. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something I'd never seen before. Avoidance. I trusted you, I said quietly, both of you. Elise squeezed his arm tighter. We thought you'd understand, she said gently. You don't really need all that money. That was the moment something inside me went still. Because it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about how easily my sacrifice had been turned into an assumption. And how loyalty, once given freely, can be quietly taken for granted. I didn't raise my voice. That surprised me later when I replayed the moment in my head. I thought anger would come first, hot and sharp, but instead there was a deep, steady ache that settled into my chest and stayed there. You don't think I need it? I asked Elise. She blinked just once, like she hadn't expected the question to land so directly. Well, she said carefully, you're not struggling, and Marcus and I are just starting out, we assumed. You assumed, I repeated. Marcus finally stepped forward. Mom, please, we didn't mean it like that. I gestured toward the chair at the table. Sit down, both of you. They did, exchanging a quick look I didn't miss. A silent check-in, a habit clearly. I sat across from them, my hands folded in my lap. They were steady. That surprised me too. Tell me exactly how much you took, I said. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again. Elise reached for his hand, her thumb rubbing slow circles over his knuckles. I handled the finances, she said, so it might sound worse than it is. That sentence told me more than she realized. How much? I asked again. Marcus exhaled, most of it. The word hit harder than any number could have. Most, I repeated softly, as in nearly all. He nodded, eyes fixed on the table. I stood up then, not because I was angry, but because I needed air. The room felt too small, like the walls were leaning in to listen. I walked to the sink and stared out the window at the backyard Marcus used to play in. I could almost see him there, skinny legs, scraped knees, calling out for me to watch him jump off the old tire swing. I turned back to them slowly. Do you know what that money was for? I asked. Marcus nodded. Elise stayed quiet. It was for my retirement, I continued, for medical bills, for the years when I can't work the way I do now. Elise finally spoke, but you're healthy. Today, I said, that's the point. They stayed for another 20 minutes. Long enough to explain, long enough to justify. Elise talked about inflation, about investments they planned to make, about how they always meant to tell me once things stabilized. Marcus nodded along, adding a few soft apologies that sounded rehearsed. We were going to pay it back, he said, eventually. Eventually. I thanked them for coming over and asked them to leave. Not because I was done, but because I knew I needed to think without their voices filling the room. After the door closed, I sat back down at the table and cried for the first time that day. Not loud sobs, just tears that came quietly, steadily, soaking into the sleeve of my sweater. I cried for the money, yes. But more than that, I cried for the trust I hadn't realized was being spent along with it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Marcus as a child, curled up on the couch with a book, falling asleep halfway through a sentence. I remembered the pride I felt writing tuition checks, the way I'd told myself it was worth it. I had never once considered that helping my son could one day make me vulnerable to him. By morning, something had shifted inside me. Not into anger, into resolve. The next step was the bank. I removed Marcus as an authorized user on the account. The teller looked at me with polite neutrality, but her eyes softened when she asked if everything was okay. Yes, I said, I will be. Then I called a financial advisor, someone I should have spoken to years earlier. She listened carefully as I explained, never interrupting, never judging. What you're describing, she said gently, is financial abuse, even when it happens within families. The word abuse made me flinch. I don't think they meant to hurt me, I said. She nodded, intent doesn't erase impact. That sentence stayed with me. Marcus didn't call for 3 days. On the 4th day, he showed up alone. Elise stayed in the car. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped like a teenager waiting to be scolded. Can we talk? He asked. I stepped aside. We sat at the table again, the same place, different weight in the air this time. She's upset, he said. I waited. She thinks you're overreacting, he continued, that you're punishing us. I met his eyes, I'm protecting myself. He frowned from us. Yes. The word landed between us, heavy and unavoidable. She said you'd always help, he said quietly. I did help, I replied. I helped until helping turned into taking. He rubbed his face with both hands. I didn't realize how bad it was. That's because you didn't want to, I said gently. It was easier not to know. He looked up sharply. That's not fair. Isn't it? I asked. He didn't answer. The weeks that followed were strained. Family members noticed the distance. Questions came cautiously at first. Everything okay with Marcus? You seem quieter lately. I didn't tell everyone the details. I didn't need to. But when my sister asked directly, I told her the truth. She didn't gasp, she didn't defend him. She just said, I'm so sorry. That validation, simple and sincere, felt like a hand on my back steadying me. Elise stopped calling entirely. No check-ins, no gratitude, no concern. That silence told its own story. Marcus, on the other hand, called occasionally. The conversations were careful, skirting around the subject like it might explode if touched. One afternoon, he said, she thinks you never liked her. I closed my eyes. This isn't about liking her. It feels like it is, he replied. Then she's making it that way, I said, because facing the truth would require accountability. He was quiet for a long time. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I took a breath. Start by acknowledging what happened, not explaining it away, not justifying it, acknowledging it. And if she whoa, he asked. That's a question you'll have to answer, I said softly. The public consequence didn't come as a dramatic showdown. It came as distance. As invitations declined, as trust withheld, as a quiet shift in how people spoke to Elise when they finally learned the truth. Not everyone turned away from her, but no one looked at her the same either. And Marcus felt it. He came over one evening, eyes tired, voice low. She says everyone judging her, he said. I nodded. That happens when actions come into the light. She says you told people. I told the truth, I replied. There's a difference. One night, weeks later, Marcus sat across from me and said something I'd been waiting to hear, not hopping for, just waiting. I didn't protect you, he said. I should have. The words weren't loud, they weren't dramatic. But they were real. I let her take control because it was easier than standing up, he continued, and I told myself you'd be okay no matter what. I reached across the table and touched his hand. I'm your mother, not your safety net. He nodded, tears slipping down his face. I know that now. I didn't forgive him that night. Forgiveness isn't a switch you flip, it's a process, a rebuilding. But something important had begun. The truth was no longer hidden. And I had stopped paying the price for someone else's comfort. After Marcus admitted he hadn't protected me, the house felt quieter than usual. Not peaceful, just still, like everything was holding its breath. I started paying closer attention to my days, the way morning light pooled on the kitchen floor, the ache in my knees when I climbed the stairs, the small calculations I made now, how long my groceries would last, which bills could wait until next month. Losing the money changed things in practical ways, but it also changed something deeper. It forced me to look at my life without the illusion of endless margin. I wasn't fragile, but I wasn't invincible either. And I had been treated like I was. Elise finally reached out a week later. She didn't call, she sent a long message, carefully worded, polite, full of phrases like misunderstanding and hurt feelings. She wrote about stress, about how hard it was to be newly married, about how she felt judged. She didn't write the word sorry. I read the message twice, then set the phone face down on the table. When Marcus came by that evening, I told him about it. She says you took things personally, he said, almost defensively. I looked at him, she took my future. He flinched. She still doesn't see it, he admitted. She thinks because it was family money, it was flexible. Family money isn't community property, I said calmly. It's trust. He nodded slowly, like he was hearing that distinction for the first time. I began meeting regularly with the financial advisor. We went through everything, what was left, what could be protected, what adjustments I needed to make. It wasn't catastrophic, but it wasn't nothing either. You'll be okay, she told me, but you'll need to be intentional. Intentional. I liked that word. It felt active, grounded, honest. I canceled a planned trip, took on a few extra tutoring hours, made changes I never thought I'd have to make at this stage of my life. And every time I did, I reminded myself, I am not doing this because I failed, I'm doing this because I survived. The family learned the truth slowly. Not through gossip, but through absence. I stopped hosting big gatherings. Marcus and Elise stopped being invited to certain events, not out of cruelty, but caution. People didn't know how to navigate the tension, so they stepped back. Elise noticed immediately. She says everyone's cold, Marcus told me one afternoon, that they're taking sides. People don't like feeling complicit, I replied. Once they know, they have to decide how close they want to stand. He was quiet for a long time. She's angry with you, he said finally. I know, I replied. And with me, he added. I looked at him. That tells you something. The real confrontation came unexpectedly. I was at the grocery store, standing in the produce aisle, when I heard my name. I turned and saw Elise walking toward me, her cart half full, her smile tight. We need to talk, she said. I nodded. We can talk. Right there between the apples and the oranges, she let it all spill out. She talked about how unfair it was, how humiliated she felt, how she'd never meant for things to go so far. I thought you'd always be there, she said. I didn't think you'd draw a line. I met her gaze evenly. You didn't think I'd say no. She crossed her arms. Families help each other. Families don't drain each other dry, I replied. Her voice rose slightly. You're acting like I stole from you. You did, I said simply. The word landed between us, undeniable. People nearby pretended not to listen. A cashier glanced over, then away. Elise's eyes filled with tears, not remorseful ones but angry ones. I never asked for this to become public, she said. I didn't either, I replied, but secrecy was your choice. She stared at me, then shook her head. You're tearing my marriage apart. I took a breath. Your marriage was already under strain. I just stopped holding it together for you. She turned and walked away without another word. My hands were shaking when I reached the checkout, but my spine felt straight. Marcus came over later that night. She told me what happened, he said quietly. I waited. She says you embarrassed her. I nodded. Truth does that sometimes. He sat heavily in the chair across from me, I didn't realize how much you were carrying for us." "That's because I never complained," I said. "I thought that was love." He looked up and Now I know love includes limits," I replied. That conversation changed him. Not overnight, not completely. But he began to ask questions Elise didn't like, began to look at bank statements instead of trusting summaries, began to notice how often decisions were made for him. One evening, he said something quietly that told me everything was shifting. "I don't think she ever planned to tell us how much was left." I nodded. People who rely on silence usually plan to keep it. He swallowed. "I should have asked sooner." "Yes," I said gently, "but asking now still matters." The public consequence wasn't loud. It was accountability. Elise stopped talking about money in front of others, stopped framing me as generous, and instead avoided the topic altogether. People noticed. Marcus took responsibility in ways he never had before, setting up repayment plans, cutting expenses, apologizing without excuses. It didn't fix everything, but it changed the direction. One afternoon, months later, Marcus handed me an envelope. Inside was a check. It wasn't for the full amount, not even close. But it was a beginning. "I know it doesn't make it right," he said, "but I want to do this." I held the check in my hands for a long moment. "This matters," I said, "not because of the money, but because of what it represents." He nodded, eyes wet. "I won't let this happen again." I believed him. Not because he promised, but because he had finally learned to see. I didn't regain everything I lost. But I regained something just as important. My voice, my boundaries, my understanding of what love really requires. After Marcus handed me that first check, something quiet but important settled between us. It wasn't relief, it wasn't forgiveness. It was accountability, and that changes the air in a room. I placed the check in a drawer instead of depositing it right away, not out of spite but because I needed time to let the gesture sink in. For years, I'd accepted words in place of action, apologies in place of responsibility. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Marcus noticed. "You don't have to cash it yet," he said one afternoon, almost nervously. "I know," I replied. "This isn't about speed, it's about consistency." He nodded, understanding more than he had before. Elise, on the other hand, grew quieter. She stopped attending family events. When she did show up, she stayed close to Marcus, her hand always on his arm as if anchoring herself. Conversations around her felt careful, polite, thin. No one confronted her outright. But no one defended her either. That absence of protection, the kind she'd relied on for so long, made her restless. "She says she feels like everyone's watching her," Marcus told me. "That's what happens when trust breaks," I said. "People observe more closely. She thinks you turn them against her." I met his eyes, I told the truth, the rest followed naturally. He didn't argue. The real shift came when Marcus started setting limits of his own. He told me about it slowly, in pieces, as if he was still testing the weight of each boundary. "I told her we need separate accounts," he said one evening. I raised my eyebrows slightly, and she wasn't happy. I waited. She said married couples don't keep secrets. I smiled sadly. Separate accounts aren't secrets, they're clarity. He exhaled. "That's what I told her." It was the first time he'd quoted my words back to me. Their arguments changed too. They weren't about money anymore, not directly. They were about control, about decision-making, about whose voice carried weight. "She says I've changed," Marcus said, "that I'm distant." "Are you?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "I think I'm just present now." That answer mattered. Months passed. I adjusted to my new reality, smaller pleasures, more careful planning, a quieter sense of independence that came from knowing I could survive without depending on anyone's approval. I stopped apologizing for my boundaries. That alone felt like a revolution. When people asked how I was doing, I didn't say fine automatically anymore. "I'm learning," I'd reply. And I was. The public consequence reached its peak at a family gathering that neither of us expected to be difficult. It was my sister's birthday, nothing formal, just a backyard barbecue, folding chairs, and the smell of charcoal drifting through the air. Elise arrived late. She greeted everyone politely, but her eyes kept darting around, measuring the room. When conversation turned to finances, college funds, retirement plans, she excused herself abruptly. Marcus stayed. My sister leaned toward me and whispered, "I'm glad you stood up for yourself." I squeezed her hand, "So am I." That was the first time someone said it out loud. Later that evening, Elise confronted Marcus in the driveway. I didn't hear every word, but I heard enough. "You let her humiliate me," she said sharply. "I didn't," Marcus replied. "I let the truth exist. You chose her over me." He paused. "I chose honesty." That sentence, quiet and steady, felt like a turning point even from a distance. The next day, Marcus came by alone. "She wants to move," he said, "far, start over." "And what do you want?" I asked. He rubbed his hands together. "I want to fix what I broke, not run from it." I nodded. "Then don't." He sighed. "She says if I keep paying you back, we'll never be able to build our life." I met his gaze. If a life requires stealing from someone else to exist, it was never sustainable. He swallowed. "I know." That conversation didn't end their marriage, but it changed its foundation. Elise no longer had unquestioned access to decisions. Marcus asked questions, requested transparency, insisted on seeing numbers. She resisted at first. Then she adapted. Or at least she pretended to. The final reckoning didn't come from me. It came from a credit report. Marcus discovered loans he hadn't known about, cards opened in his name, balances hidden behind minimum payments and reassurances. When he showed me the papers, his hands were shaking. "I thought it was just us," he said, "just you." I closed my eyes. Patterns don't stop with one person. He confronted her that night. She cried. She blamed stress. She blamed fear. She didn't deny it. The truth, once fully revealed, changed everything. Elise moved out a month later. Not angrily, not dramatically. Quietly. Marcus didn't ask me to celebrate. He didn't ask me to choose sides. He just said, "I see it now." And that was enough. Healing didn't come quickly. Marcus grieved the marriage he thought he had. Elise grieved the loss of control she never admitted she wanted. And I grieved the years I'd believed love meant limitless giving. But grief, when faced honestly, can teach. The repayments continued. Small, steady, real. I deposited the checks now, not because I needed to, but because I trusted the intent behind them. "I want you to feel safe again," Marcus said once. I nodded. "I'm working on that." One morning, as I sat at the kitchen table balancing my new budget, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of being needed too much. Not of being abandoned. Not of being honest. I had survived betrayal by the people I loved most. And I was still standing. Healing doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost shyly, in moments so ordinary you don't recognize them as milestones until much later. For me, it came one morning while I was folding laundry. I had the radio on low, a soft gospel song humming through the kitchen. Sunlight spilled across the table, catching on the edges of neatly stacked towels. My body moved without tension. My mind wasn't racing ahead to worst-case scenarios or replaying old conversations. I realized suddenly that I felt steady. Not whole, not untouched. But steady. Marcus and I found a new rhythm. He called every Sunday evening now, not out of obligation but intention. Sometimes we talked about practical things, repayment schedules, his job, plans for the week. Other times we talked about nothing at all. One night he said, "I didn't know how much pressure I was under until it lifted." I understood that feeling. When you live inside someone else's expectations long enough, I said, you forget which thoughts are yours. He was quiet for a moment. I don't think I ever asked myself what I wanted. That's common, I replied gently, especially when someone else is very good at deciding for you. Elise didn't disappear from our lives completely. She sent a message once months after moving out. It was short, careful. She said she hoped I was well, that she never meant to cause harm. That fear had guided her more than she wanted to admit. There was still no apology. But there was honesty. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I didn't owe her closure. I had learned that lesson the hard way. The financial rebuilding was slow but manageable. I adjusted my expectations, downsized my plans, learned to take pride in smaller victories, an emergency fund rebuilt dollar by dollar, a sense of control returning to my hands. I no longer shared access to anything I couldn't afford to lose. That boundary wasn't bitterness. It was wisdom. One afternoon, Marcus came over and helped me reorganize old files. We found his college acceptance letter again, tucked between receipts and photos. He held it for a long moment. "You gave me everything," he said quietly. I shook my head. "I gave you what I could, the rest was always yours to build." He nodded. "I'm trying to do that now, honestly." I believed him. Not because he said the right words, but because his actions had become consistent. Family gatherings grew easier. Not carefree but honest. No one pretended nothing had happened, and no one needed to. The tension had burned off, leaving behind something clearer, truer. At my sister's house one evening, she pulled me aside and said, "I admire how you handled this." I smiled faintly. I didn't always feel strong. "Strength isn't a feeling," she replied, "it's a choice." I carried that with me. Marcus didn't rush into anything new. He focused on work, on therapy, on understanding how easily love and loyalty can be tangled into something unhealthy if left unquestioned. One day he said, "I thought being a good son meant keeping the peace." "And now?" I asked. "And now I know it means telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable." I reached for his hand. That's all I ever wanted. As for me, I changed too. I stopped introducing myself through my sacrifices. I was no longer just the mother who paid for college, the woman who always gave, the one who never asked. I was someone who valued herself enough to protect her future. That shift showed up in small ways. I said no more often. I asked questions without apology. I trusted my instincts again. One quiet evening, months later, Marcus and I sat on the porch watching the sky darken. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, "not just for the money, for the way I stopped seeing you." I swallowed hard. "I know. I won't let anyone do that again," he added, "to you or to me." I believed him. What I learned through all of this is something I wish every parent understood before love blinds them. Helping your child should never require harming yourself. Trust should never mean access without accountability. And loyalty that demands silence is not loyalty, it's control. You can love deeply and still draw lines. You can give generously and still protect your future. And you can survive betrayal without becoming bitter. The money will take years to fully recover. But my sense of self returned much faster. I sleep better now. I stand straighter. And when I look at my son, I don't see a debt. I see a man learning to be responsible for his choices. That is something no savings account could ever buy. There are moments in life when love asks you a hard question. Not how much you're willing to give, but how much you're willing to lose before you say enough. For a long time, I believed being a good mother meant never drawing a line. That sacrifice was proof of love, that if my child needed me, I was supposed to say yes, no matter the cost to myself. But love that empties you without your consent is not love. And help that turns into expectation becomes entitlement. What this experience taught me is something I wish I had understood sooner. You can love your child fiercely and still protect your future. You can forgive without forgetting. And you can choose truth over comfort, even when it hurts. Standing up for myself didn't make me a bad mother, it made me an honest one. If you're listening to this and you feel guilt for setting boundaries with family, if you've been told that love means giving until there's nothing left, please hear me when I say this. Protecting yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. So I'll leave you with this question. If the people you love most crossed a line, would you have the courage to draw one of your own? If this story resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to hear more real, emotional stories about family betrayal, healing, and finding your way back to yourself, please like this video and subscribe. Thank you for listening. And thank you for being here.